Ross.
Thank you. Good afternoon, or morning, good morning. My name is Shannon Smith. I represent Mrs. Crumbley. I believe that I've met you once before when you testified in court at the preliminary exam. Do you recall that?
I do. If
I ask you any questions that are at all confusing, can you please stop me and let me know?
I will.
Okay, thank you. I want to start off by talking about your relationship with Jennifer Crumbley. You testified today that you had a business relationship with her. Is that correct?
It was a business relationship, but also a friendship, but we were not super close friends.
Okay, so you would agree that at the time prior to November 30th of 2021, Jennifer Crumbley was also a friend to you. Not particularly close, but a friend.
Correct.
And the farm that you own, do you call it a farm or a barn?
It's both.
Okay, I keep using the word interchangeably, so I thought I'd ask.
Either works.
The property you own is approximately 51 acres, is that correct?
Correct.
And it's fair to say that to get to your property, there are long roads in a very rural area, is that correct?
Yes.
So your farm is not right up against cities or areas with a lot of traffic, correct?
Correct.
On those roads that are close to the farm, it's fair to say the cell signal cuts in and out for different cell phones.
Correct.
And you personally, at the time all of this took place, had a phone through Verizon Wireless, correct?
Correct.
And you would be able to use your Verizon phone while at the farm.
For the most part, depending on the area and also just the day.
So there were some parts of the farm or parts of the day where you would also have trouble getting a signal to make phone calls or send text messages, correct?
Correct.
And you know from the other people who board and come to the farm that other people also have internet issues and are unable to receive calls and texts while at the barn.
Yes, sometimes people would struggle with that.
It sounds like there's one little area by a picnic table where people kind of flock if they want to check their texts or get data. Is that correct?
It very well could be. There are a couple areas that seem to maybe be a little bit more reliable service-wise, but even then, like sometimes if it's too windy, things don't work.
Now, you testified that Jennifer Crumbley gave you information that her son was weird, although she talked about vacations and some other things with him. Is that true?
Correct.
And you testified that you had concerns about her son prior to the events that unfolded on November 30th, correct?
I have not voiced to her that I had seen concerns, but in my mind, I had thought that, some of the things that she had described or how she didn't really talk about him much, or if, when she had talked about him, it was very vague. Like people like to talk about their children, and she did not talk about her children.
One moment. Whatever's on the screen is not an exhibit, and so
do I just go ahead and turn this off? It's the button that I push.
There's a button for it to go use.
Should I just pull my plug out?
I don't know. Is this yours? Or
Yes.
Is this yours?
Yeah, this is my laptop. I didn't realize it was turned on to my laptop, so my desktop was evidently up there. Okay, so Mrs. or I'm sorry, Ms. Pennock, when you, so you've testified obviously here today, but you recall testifying at a preliminary exam that took place back in 2022, correct?
Yes.
And on the day you testified in 2022 at the preliminary exam, you did the same thing we saw here in court. You raised your right hand and swore to tell the truth, correct?
Correct.
And on that date, you did your best to take the stand and tell the truth about your knowledge of the information in this case.
Correct.
Now, on that date when you testified, you were specifically asked, have you ever been given reason to believe he was not mentally sound, that he needed professional, medical help? And your answer was no on that occasion, correct?
Correct.
You were also asked, have you ever had reason to believe the shooter was homicidal or he would hurt other people? And your answer was no, correct?
Correct.
Now, today you testified that the shooter, you were told about issues related to the shooter and him being weird, correct?
Correct.
You testified about that issue at the preliminary exam, and I'm on page 55, and you were asked, when you said that...
Objection, Your Honor, you're on page 55 of what?
The preliminary exam.
So the witness doesn't have that, and I think she doesn't have it.
This is impeachment.
Right, but she's referencing a page number to something that nobody else
I
has.
think she was referencing the page number so that you know where she is.
Right.
in the exam
Okay,
transcript.
it's not an exhibit, so I'm just wondering if we're gonna refer to certain things that she said that she be allowed to also see that before she answers.
Well, I think she said, if she doesn't remember, if she doesn't recall, right?
Otherwise, with impeachment, I don't need to put the...
Yeah, so ask her if she recalls being asked a certain question.
Okay. At the preliminary exam, you testified about whether James and Jen had issues with their son.
Do you recall that?
I recall.
And on that date, you said, I had never gotten the feeling that Jen and James had those types of issues with their son, correct?
Correct. I did not know if there were specific issues, as they had never told me flat out that there were issues, but just some of their behaviors that they or comments that they had made, indirect comments, made me think that there may have been issues at some point.
So it's your testimony today that you thought there may have been issues, but when you were asked under oath and testified in 2022, you specifically said, I had never gotten the feeling that Jen and James had those types of issues with their son.
I did not know. I don't have any paper proof or documentations of conversations to know for sure, so they're just my feelings.
Okay, I'm not asking you if you have documentations or proof. I am just saying that on that date in 2022, which was closer in time to the events in this case, your testimony, sworn testimony, was that James and Jen did not have those issues with their son, correct?
Correct.
Now, when the math drawing was sent over to you by Mrs. Crumbley, the math paper her son wrote on, do you know what I'm talking about?
Yes.
Okay. You ultimately saw that math paper, and you would agree with me that Jennifer appeared very concerned about what was going on, correct?
She had stated that she was concerned.
Okay. So she sends you the math paper and expresses concern.
Yes.
Now, you testified that when you heard there was a shooting at Oxford High School, you knew who the shooter was, correct?
My feeling with the information that I was given before I had actually seen it on the news and who the shooter actually was, I had my feelings about who the shooter was.
So you did not believe that the shooter would have committed a school shooting based on the math paper alone, correct?
I do not know for sure.
If you saw that math paper and thought there would be a school shooting, you would have told someone, correct?
I cannot predict the future that there would have been a shooting, but I was very concerned about the math test that was sent to me. And I did talk to my parents about the math test that I was shown, and my understanding is that with Jennifer and James meeting with the school that this was discussed.
Okay, we can agree that after the meeting about the math paper, Jennifer was concerned. We already went through that, yes?
Yes,
We can agree that she sent you a picture of the math paper and you also felt concerned, correct?
correct,
And we can agree that you did not call law enforcement or police to say, hey, I think a school shooting is going to unfold, correct?
correct.
At the time you saw the math paper and were concerned, you would have stopped a school shooting if you predicted it was going to happen, correct?
I would not have known that something like this would have happened.
You wouldn't have thought something like this would happen, correct?
Correct,
What ended up happening was horrible, correct?
correct,
And it was not anything that you expected even, correct?
correct.
So when you are telling the jury that you hear about the shooting and you're thinking about the math paper, you know it's at Oxford High School, your testimony was you had an idea of who the shooter was, correct?
Correct,
In order to reach that conclusion at that time, you had to rely on hindsight, looking backwards at things that you believed supported Jennifer's son may be the shooter, correct?
yes, the thing that made me believe that I knew who the shooter was realizing the math test that was sent to me that morning.
Right.
So after the shooting happened, I had a feeling of who the shooter was because of the math test that was sent to me that morning.
Okay, so it's looking backwards, connecting the dots of things you see that were of concern, and knowing the shooting happened, that helps you put it together who the shooter is.
Correct,
But again, if you saw that math paper and had known or had a crystal ball and knew the shooting was going to unfold, you would have certainly called police or done something to stop it.
absolutely,
You also would have said to Mrs. Crumbley, hey, I think your son is going to do something to hurt people, correct?
correct,
Or, hey, I think your son might do something to hurt himself.
correct,
And it's fair to say that you did not send Mrs. Crumbley messages along those lines.
correct.
Now, you testified that you were being kind to Mrs. Crumbley. I don't believe you used the word being kind, but I characterize it as kind. When you said to her, I'm so sorry, you have to deal with this, text messages along those lines that have been admitted, correct?
Correct,
And you are aware that Mrs. Crumbley from the text messages was saying she can't go home,
correct,
and you were expressing concern for her in response to her saying, I can't go home.
correct,
We can agree there was a strong public opinion against the Crumbleys that you were aware of.
Correct.
Many people were very angry with the Crumbley parents when they knew the Crumbley parents were the parents of the shooter.
Correct.
So one of Mrs. Crumbley's concerns that was discussed in these texts with you were for her safety and the safety of her husband.
Correct.
And that poured over onto you as well. As the barn owner, you needed to be concerned about your affiliation with the Crumbleys.
Correct.
And you needed to be concerned to make sure that you were not specifically harmed by anyone for being affiliated with them, correct?
I wanted to make sure that myself, my family, and my barn family were also safe.
Well, that was going to be my next question. You were concerned about yourself, and I'm sorry, you said your family?
My close family, and then also what we call a barn family, or people that are boarded at my facility.
Thank you. And that's why you made indications to Mrs. Crumbley about not coming to the barn or only coming with a police escort, because you were watching out for what you needed to protect, which is yourself, the people you care about, and your boarders.
Correct.
When you write to Mrs. Crumbley in the texts that were admitted, please stay safe, you genuinely wanted Mrs. Crumbley to stay safe.
Correct.
And Mrs. Crumbley was explaining that she can't go home. Those texts speak for themselves.
Correct.
And Mrs. Crumbley ultimately says that they are staying out of town for a few days.
Correct.
And it's your understanding they were not returning back to their home address.
Correct.
In the text, you say to Mrs. Crumbley, you give her some advice to be honest about everything, correct?
Correct.
At no point, there is no point where Mrs. Crumbley says to you, hey, I'm gonna lie about this, correct?
Correct.
There's no point where she says, Kara, please take my side and lie about anything, correct?
Correct.
When you're giving her the advice to tell the truth, she's not saying to you, I'm not planning to do that, right?
Correct.
And in your texts, you confirm to Mrs. Crumbley that you don't remotely think it's Jen and James' fault that the shooter did this, correct?
I did put that in the text message, correct.
And then Mrs. Crumbley responds that she wishes there had been warnings, correct?
Correct.
And when you text her back, you say there probably were, but nobody saw them, right?
I did have that in my message, correct.
And if you had seen warnings that the shooter would do something like he did, you certainly would have voiced that to Mrs. Crumbley.
Your Honor, I believe she's been asked that question a couple of times.
Well, I think she asked if you saw that picture in People's 74, would you have called the police and said there's a mass shooting, there's going to be a mass shooting? So I think the question is somewhat different.
I believe she also asked her if you would have said something to Mrs. Crumbley, I'm concerned.
Did she ask you that already?
Yes, a variation.
I did ask that, but then further down in the text messages, the conversation shifts, and the conversation is specifically, again, about signs and warnings, and so that's why I'm asking this witness a question about it again,
Okay.
only because it reappears.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so you never said to Jennifer Crumbley, when you two were discussing the word warnings, hey, I think there were warnings, correct?
Can you rephrase that?
You did not say to Mrs. Crumbley, when you guys were talking about her wishing there were warnings, you didn't say, Jennifer, there were warnings.
That is correct, because
That's just my question. You
Okay.
did not say, Jennifer, there were warnings.
Correct.
And in fact, you continued to go on to be kind to Mrs. Crumbley and continue working out the terms of buying this horse, correct?
Correct.
And you continued to be concerned and telling Mrs. Crumbley, stay where you are, and that you didn't want people hurting them, correct?
Correct.
When Mrs. Crumbley was commenting to you about a lawyer costing $200,000, you understood she was trying to gather money together to pay a lawyer, retain a lawyer.
Correct.
And at that point, the shooting by the shooter had taken place, correct?
Correct.
And you do not know who the lawyer was for that Mrs. Crumbley was going to be thinking about paying $200,000 to, correct?
I did not know for sure.
May I have one moment, Your Honor?
Sure.
Thank you. Okay. Ms. Pennock, in light of your testimony, I just want to confirm, you have never suspected that Jennifer Crumbley has stolen anything from you, correct?
No.
You've never filed a police report or made that kind of claim to Mrs. Crumbley or anyone, correct?
No.
Thank you.